The little girl stumbled out of the restroom, gasping for air. Tears streamed down her face as she grabbed the janitor's arm. "Sir, please don't go in," she begged, her voice shaking. The janitor frowned. "What happened? Who's inside?" She gulped, her tiny hands cold as ice. I saw him." The janitor's blood ran cold. "Saw who?" Her lips quivered. "The man in the mirror, but he had no face." The janitor's breath caught. Then bang! The restroom door slammed shut, and from inside came a sound no human should ever make. But before we dive into this chilling mystery, ask yourself, what would you do if a terrified child told you something was inside, something that shouldn't exist? Would you check? Or would you run? Hit subscribe to Epic Story Moments, because what you're about to hear will haunt you long after this video ends. And if you dare, tell us in the comments, would you have opened that door? It was a seemingly normal school day. The bells rang, signaling the start of the morning session. Students shuffled into classrooms, exchanging excited chatter, some rushing, some laughing, while others seemed lost in their own thoughts. The halls were filled with the familiar hum of school life, the echoes of footsteps on the tile floor, the occasional slam of a locker, and the distant chatter from the cafeteria, where lunch preparations were in full swing. Everything felt ordinary, but there was something different today. Something unseen that lingered in the air, unnoticed by most but present all the same. The air felt heavier than usual, as though it were filled with an invisible tension. The kind that you can't quite put your finger on, but you feel deep in your gut. And deep within the school, a secret waited to be revealed. Inside the dimly lit restroom at the end of the hall, something strange was about to happen. A little girl, no older than 8, had just entered the restroom, her steps quick and nervous, as if she were trying to outrun something. She glanced nervously around the empty restroom, her small hands gripping the edges of her backpack strap. Her heart raced, the sound of it thudding in her chest. Something wasn't right. She could feel it. It was as though someone was watching her. The lights flickered briefly, and the girl froze. She could have sworn she heard faint whispers coming from one of the stalls. But there was no one else in the restroom. She took a cautious step forward, her sneakers barely making a sound on the cold tile floor. Her breath hitched as the whispers grew louder, more insistent. With each step, the hairs on the back of her neck stood on end. She wasn't alone. Panic surged through her, and her hands trembled as she reached for the door of the nearest stall. But just before she could turn the handle, a shadow flickered across the cracked tile floor. The whispering stopped. For a moment, there was an eerie silence. Then, the sound of something or someone breathing echoed through the restroom. Cold, shallow, almost unnatural. She backed away slowly, her heart pounding in her chest. The girl spun around, desperate to escape, but the door to the restroom was already ajar. It was too late. She turned and ran. The girl burst out of the restroom, her face pale, her eyes wide with terror. She gasped for air, her breath ragged, as she clutched her chest as if she had just seen something that wasn't meant to be seen. The hallway, which had once seemed so full of life, suddenly felt impossibly quiet. Without stopping, she ran toward the nearest adult she could find, the janitor. "Sir, please don't go in there." Her voice cracked, barely above a whisper, but the fear in her eyes was unmistakable. Her tiny body was shaking from head to toe, and she clung to his sleeve desperately. The janitor, a middle-aged man who had worked in this school for over a decade, blinked in confusion. He had seen plenty of frightened students in his time, but this was different. He frowned at the girl, his brow furrowed with concern. What could possibly have scared her so much? "What happened? Who's in there?" he asked, trying to remain calm. But the girl just shook her head, her lips trembling. "I saw," she gasped, struggling to find the words. "I saw him, the man in the mirror, but he didn't have a face." The janitor froze. The man in the mirror. The word sent a chill through him, something he couldn't shake. He had heard the rumors, the whispers from older students about strange happenings in the restroom. Stories about a figure, a shadow, that would appear in the mirrors. But those were just stories, weren't they? Stories. Until now. He took a deep breath, his mind racing. What if it was true? What if something was in that restroom? Something he couldn't explain? He could feel the hairs on the back of his neck standing on end as the girl's fearful gaze locked onto his. He had to know. He had to see for himself. With a deep, steadying breath, the janitor walked toward the restroom. Every step felt heavier than the last. The hallway around him seemed to grow colder, the walls closing in. As he approached the door, he hesitated for a moment, his hand hovering just above the handle. But then, with a deep breath, he turned the handle and pushed the door open. The bathroom was eerily silent. There was no sign of anyone inside. No figures, no movement, not even the faintest sound. The mirror above the sink gleamed under the harsh fluorescent light. But as his gaze drifted across the room, his eyes landed on the mirror. Something was wrong. He couldn't explain it, but the reflection seemed off. It wasn't just a distortion from the fog glass. It was something more. The janitor's blood ran cold as he looked closer. There, staring back at him from the mirror, was a figure. A man without a face. The janitor's hand trembled as he reached out, pressing his palm against the cold glass. His reflection shifted, and for a fleeting moment, he saw the figure move. But the figure never moved from the mirror. The janitor's breath caught in his throat, his mind racing, his body frozen in place. He pulled away from the mirror, his eyes wide with disbelief. The door to the restroom slammed shut behind him, and from inside came a sound that no human should ever make. It was a laugh, a low, guttural laugh. The janitor's blood ran cold as he stepped away from the mirror, his mind still reeling from what he had just seen. He had always heard the whispers about this restroom, about the strange happenings and rumors, but he had never believed them. Not until now. His hand trembled as he wiped the sweat from his brow, his eyes still fixed on the mirror. The reflection that had stared back at him was now gone, and the restroom felt colder than ever before. He needed to leave. He needed to get out of that room. But just as he reached for the door handle, the silence was shattered by a piercing scream. The scream echoed through the restroom, making the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end. It wasn't a scream of a student in distress or even a teacher. No! This scream was unnatural. It wasn't human. It was as if the scream itself had come from deep within the walls of the school. It reverberated through the very structure of the building, sending vibrations into the floors. The janitor's heart skipped a beat. What was that? He froze for a moment, his eyes darting around the restroom, searching for any sign of the source of the scream. But there was nothing. The restroom remained eerily still. The only sound now was the pounding of his own heart. It was as if the school had come alive with that scream. The janitor's mind raced. He had heard rumors of strange occurrences happening in this building. Students talked about the eerie atmosphere in the halls late at night, about hearing footsteps when no one was there, about seeing shadows move on their own. But he had never paid attention to the stories. He had always assumed they were just that, stories. But this felt different. The scream echoed once again, even louder this time, causing the janitor's legs to go weak beneath him. It seemed to come from deep within the heart of the school, as if something was alive in the very structure of the building. He clenched his fists, his breath coming in short gasps. He had to investigate. He had to figure out what was going on. With a final deep breath, he turned and made his way toward the stall where the scream had come from. But as he approached, the air around him grew colder. It felt as though the temperature in the room had dropped by several degrees, and his breath came out in visible puffs of vapor. It wasn't just the temperature. It was as if the very atmosphere of the restroom had changed. It felt wrong. Every step he took felt heavier than the last, and the faint sound of the scream continued to echo in his ears. His hands shook as he reached for the stall door, his mind screaming at him to stop. But his feet continued to move forward, drawn by the need to understand. He reached out and touched the cold metal of the door handle. It felt like ice beneath his fingers. He hesitated for a moment, his heart racing, his mind a whirl of conflicting thoughts. Should he really do this? Should he open the door? But before he could think further, the scream came again. This time, it was louder, more frantic. The sound seemed to tear through the walls, its intensity shaking him to his core. Without thinking, the janitor threw open the stall door, and what he saw inside made his blood run cold. Inside the stall, the air was thick with an oppressive stillness. The lights above flickered ominously, casting long shadows across the floor. The janitor's eyes darted around, scanning the tiny room. It was empty. The stall was completely empty, except for one thing. At the far end of the room, standing against the wall, was a small, cracked mirror, and staring back at him from the mirror was a face. But it wasn't his face. The face staring back at him was pale, hollow, and featureless. There were no eyes, no mouth, no nose, just a smooth, empty surface. The janitor's breath caught in his throat as he tried to process what he was seeing. His own reflection was gone, replaced by that thing, the face that shouldn't exist. It was like looking into an abyss. He stumbled backward, his heart pounding in his chest, his mind screaming for him to leave. But his body refused to obey. His eyes were locked onto the mirror, unable to look away, drawn into the horrifying void of that faceless entity. Suddenly, the air around him grew heavier, and a cold, almost unnatural breeze began to swirl around the restroom. The janitor's pulse quickened as he tried to tear his gaze away from the mirror, but the more he struggled, the more he felt like he was being pulled into it. The sound of footsteps echoed from behind him. He whirled around, panic flooding his senses. There was no one there, but the footsteps continued. Closer, the restroom door slammed shut with a deafening bang, the force rattling the walls. The janitor turned back to the mirror, and for the briefest moment, he thought he saw something move in the reflection. A shadow that wasn't there in the room. Then, as quickly as it had started, everything went silent again. The mirror was empty. The restroom felt still. And for a moment, the janitor thought it was all a nightmare. But then he heard it. The laugh. It was low, guttural, inhuman. It came from the mirror. The janitor stood there, his heart hammering in his chest. As he stared at the mirror in front of him, a feeling of dread washed over him. And for the first time in his life, he could not explain what was happening. The restroom, which had always been a simple and quiet place, now felt alive with a dark energy. The mirror, the one object in the room that had never seemed out of place, had now become the source of his deepest terror. For years, it had simply hung there, reflecting the mundane. Students came in, washed their hands, and left without giving the mirror a second thought. It was an ordinary piece of glass, hanging above the sink in the corner of the room. But now, it was anything but ordinary. The reflection staring back at him was not his own. The janitor's mind raced as he tried to understand what was happening. What was this? What was he seeing? He had never believed in the supernatural. He had heard the whispers from students about strange happenings in the school, stories about shadows in the hallways, eerie sounds at night, and the occasional flickering of lights. But he had always dismissed them as just rumors, the overactive imaginations of children. But this was different. The figure staring back at him was no longer a reflection of himself. The janitor saw it, its eyes hollow and empty, staring through him as if it could see his very soul. The mirror had come alive. It was as though the glass was no longer just a reflection of reality, but a portal to something far more sinister. He could feel his body begin to tremble as his gaze locked onto the thing in the mirror, unable to look away. It was like staring into the void, a vast emptiness that seemed to stretch beyond the surface of the glass. And in that void, he saw a face that wasn't his. It was pale, ghostly, and lifeless. The eyes that stared back at him were not human, and the mouth twisted into a grin that sent a shiver down his spine. He tried to move, to look away, but his body refused to obey. His feet felt heavy, like they were trapped in some invisible force that held him to the spot. The janitor wanted to scream, to shout for help, but his throat felt tight, as though the air itself had thickened around him. He could feel his pulse pounding in his ears, the fear tightening its grip on his chest. The mirror's surface began to ripple, and the janitor's breath caught in his throat. What was happening? It was as if the glass itself was coming to life, its reflection warping, bending, and shifting. The janitor stepped back in a panic, his mind struggling to understand the impossible scene unfolding before him. The face in the mirror twisted and turned, its features warping in unnatural ways. The mouth opened wider, its grin becoming more grotesque. And then, for a moment, the mirror seemed to blink. It was alive. The reflection of the janitor's own face began to blur, and he could no longer see himself. The mirror had taken on a new form. Its once ordinary surface, now a distorted version of reality. The janitor's reflection was no longer there at all. All that remained was a creature, the thing, in the mirror, smiling at him with an expression of pure malice. The janitor stepped backward again, his back hitting the wall behind him. His mind screamed for him to run, to get out of the restroom before it was too late. But the door was locked. He had never been able to find the key. And now, with the mirror's eerie reflection bearing down on him, he knew he was trapped. Trapped with the thing in the mirror. His breath quickened as the figure in the mirror reached out, its fingers pressing against the glass. The janitor wanted to scream, but no sound escaped his lips. The mirror seemed to draw him in, its darkness surrounding him. He could feel the cold air of the restroom, but the chill from the mirror was different. It was as if the cold was coming from within the mirror itself. And then, the truth hit him. The school had been hiding something for years. The haunted mirror was not just a myth. It was real. The mirror wasn't a simple piece of glass. It was a gateway, a portal to something far darker. The janitor remembered the stories the students had told him. The ones about how the restroom had always been strange, how some had claimed to see things in the mirror that didn't belong. He had always laughed off those stories as superstitions. But now, he knew they were true. The mirror had been waiting, hidden in plain sight, for someone to come along. And now, it had chosen him. As he tried to tear his gaze away from the mirror, the reflection of the creature in the glass seemed to grow stronger. It began to move, not just shifting its features, but leaving the mirror. The janitor could see it slowly stretching, as though it was coming toward him, reaching out through the glass. The janitor's heart raced in terror as he finally managed to pull his eyes away from the mirror. But the reflection, that hideous thing, still haunted his vision. It was as if it had seeped into his mind, following him even when he turned his back. He had to get out. He had to escape. But the mirror was no longer just a reflection. It was a part of him, something he could not escape. As he backed away toward the door, his hands shaking with fear, the figure in the mirror continued to stare. It watched him with those hollow eyes, its grin widening with every passing second. The janitor's pulse quickened as the door suddenly creaked open. He didn't wait to see who was behind it. He rushed out, running through the hallways, desperate to get as far away from that restroom as possible. But as he fled, he couldn't shake the feeling that the thing in the mirror was following him, always watching, always waiting for the next person to come along. The hallway was eerily silent, and for a moment, you could almost forget that anything dangerous had ever happened there. Dust settled over the faded lockers, and the flickering fluorescent lights above barely illuminated the narrow corridor. But there was something about this place, a certain oppressive energy, that made the hair on the back of your neck stand on end. The walls seemed to hold secrets, whispers of forgotten things that should have stayed buried. It was as if the very bricks and tiles were soaked in the history of the unspeakable. It had been abandoned for years. No one stepped foot in this hallway anymore. The doors were locked and the windows boarded up. Yet, The unsettling whispers about what had happened there remained, the stories persisted. A tale shared in hushed tones by those who had dared venture near it in the past. Some said it was haunted, but others spoke of something far darker. A force lurking in the depths of the old school building, something that had never truly been laid to rest. One evening, after dark, a group of curious students decided they had had enough of the rumors. They were tired of hearing about it, tired of wondering. They were determined to uncover the truth behind the abandoned hallway. Armed with only flashlights, a camera, and their shaky courage, they entered the school after hours, not knowing that this decision would change their lives forever. The door creaked as it opened, and the cold, stale air from within rushed out, carrying with it the scent of dampness and decay. As they stepped inside, the temperature immediately dropped. The air was thick, as though the walls themselves were holding their breath. Waiting for something, the once familiar scent of chalk and old books had long since faded, replaced by a musty odor of rot. The students hesitated at first, casting nervous glances at each other, unsure whether they should proceed, but their curiosity pushed them forward. The first few steps were easy. The sound of their feet echoing in the quiet hallway was the only noise. But soon, the feeling of dread began to creep in. The further they walked, the heavier the air became. It was as if the hallway was breathing with them, exhaling each time they moved forward, drawing them in deeper. They reached the end of the hall, where the last door stood, a door they had been hearing about in every story they had been told. At first, they did not notice it, blending seamlessly into the wallpaper and the faded rows of lockers. But as they approached, the temperature dropped even further. The air felt dense, almost suffocating, like the walls were pressing in on them. One of the students, a girl named Sarah, hesitated. Her hand reached out, trembling slightly, to touch the door handle. But the moment her fingers brushed the cold metal, a strange noise filled the air. It was a low, guttural growl, like the sound of something deep beneath the earth, something ancient and powerful. The students froze in place, eyes wide in terror, hearts racing. Their flashlights flickered erratically, casting long shadows against the walls. Every muscle in their bodies screamed to run, but their feet would not move. Suddenly, the door swung open of its own accord. Inside, there was nothing but pitch darkness. The flashlight beams barely touched the edges of the room before they vanished into the blackness. The air felt heavier in this room, oppressive and thick, as though it had been trapped there for years, waiting for someone to disturb it. And disturb it they had. One by one, the students stepped into the room, each feeling the oppressive weight of the darkness pulling them deeper. The room seemed to stretch on forever, its boundaries fading into the distance, as if they had entered a space where time and reality no longer applied. The walls closed in around them, their minds racing as they tried to make sense of what they were experiencing. They could feel the temperature dropping even further, colder than the rest of the building had ever been. Then, just as they reached the middle of the room, one of the students screamed. It was a blood-curdling scream, one that seemed to echo off the walls and shake the very foundation of the room. The others turned, hearts in their throats, only to find Sarah standing frozen in place, her eyes wide with terror, her body trembling violently. She was pointing toward the far end of the room, her mouth opening and closing as though trying to scream, but no sound came out. Her eyes were locked onto something that none of them could see, and then, slowly, they saw it. There, in the far corner, stood a figure, a tall, dark shape, perfectly still, its features hidden in the shadows. The students did not dare move closer, their flashlights shaking as they tried to illuminate the corner. But the beam never quite reached the figure. It was as though the shadows themselves were protecting it, refusing to let it be seen. The students stood frozen, unable to look away, terrified of what they were seeing, and yet unable to look away. Then, the whispers began. They were faint at first, like the rustling of leaves on a windy day. But as they focused, the whispers grew louder, more insistent. The voices were speaking in a language they could not understand. It was as if the room itself was alive, and it was speaking directly to them, beckoning them to come closer, to enter the darkness with it. But they did not dare, they could not. The fear was too intense. They turned to run, to escape, but the room seemed to shift before their eyes, the walls growing longer, stretching out in front of them, trapping them within. They scrambled for the door, their hands shaking as they fumbled with the handle, but it would not open. It was as if the door had become part of the room itself, no longer able to move. Then, just when they thought they could not take any more, the whispers stopped. The air grew still. The door creaked open on its own. The students ran. They did not wait to see what would happen next. They fled through the hallway, their feet pounding against the floor, their hearts in their throats. As they reached the stairs, they could still hear the whispers, faintly in the background, calling to them. But they were outside now, safe. Or were they? Because even though they had escaped the room, the presence they felt within it still lingered. They could feel it following them, hovering in the corners of their vision, waiting to return. And so they left, but the hallway remained. For years, no one knew what lay beyond that locked door. It had stood there, in the heart of the old mansion, untouched and sealed off from the rest of the world. The room was a mystery, one that had lingered in the minds of the staff and visitors for decades. Some believed it was just a storage space, perhaps forgotten over time. Others whispered about the strange noises that could be heard emanating from within the room late at night. But no one dared open it. The mansion, built in the early 1800s, was an architectural marvel, towering over the nearby village. Over the years, it had changed owners many times. With each new occupant, rumors swirled about the strange occurrences within the mansion. Flickering lights, objects moved inexplicably, and odd sounds heard in the dead of night. But the locked room was always at the heart of these whispers. No one knew exactly what had been sealed away there, and those who did never spoke of it. The staff knew better than to ask questions about the room. They had heard the stories from the previous owners, the ones who had either vanished mysteriously or fled, never to return. It was said that the room held the mansion's darkest secret, one that no one could afford to know. But over the years, that mystery began to gnaw at the minds of the curious. One day, after a long series of strange events in the mansion, a group of investigators decided to find out the truth. They had heard rumors for years, and now they were determined to uncover the unsettling truth behind the locked room. Armed with tools, cameras, and their courage, they set out to explore the mansion's secrets. It was an old building, and it showed its age. The floors creaked underfoot, and the walls were thick with dust. But the investigators could feel the weight of history pressing down on them as they made their way toward the room. The locked door loomed ahead, standing as a barrier to the unknown. The investigators exchanged nervous glances. They knew what they were about to do could change everything, but none of them were prepared for what they were about to uncover. John, the leader of the group, was the first to approach the door. His hand shook slightly as he placed a key in the lock. With a deep breath, he turned it. There was a soft click, and the door creaked open, revealing the darkness inside. The room was small, almost claustrophobic, and the air inside was stale, as though it had not been disturbed in years. Dust particles hung in the air like ghosts, and the faint smell of mildew lingered. As the light from their flashlights illuminated the room, they saw the old furniture covered in layers of dust and cobwebs. But there was one item that caught their attention immediately, a large, ornate chest, standing in the far corner of the room. The chest was massive, its surface covered in intricate carvings that seemed to shimmer faintly in the flashlight's beam. The air in the room seemed to grow heavier, and the investigators could feel a chill running down their spines. It was as if the chest itself was alive, waiting for them to touch it. They slowly approached the chest, their footsteps muffled by the thick layer of dust on the floor. John reached out, his hand trembling as he brushed the surface of the chest. As his fingers made contact, a sharp, sudden noise echoed through the room, a low, guttural growl that seemed to come from the very walls themselves. The investigators froze, their eyes wide with terror. But it wasn't the chest that had made the sound. It was something else, something far more sinister. The room seemed to shift. The temperature dropped even further, and the investigators could see their breath in the air. It was as though the room itself had taken on a life of its own, reacting to their presence. The whispers began, faint at first, like the rustling of dry leaves. But soon they grew louder. The voices spoke in a language they could not understand. It was an ancient language, one that seemed to have been lost to time. John turned to his team, his voice barely above a whisper. "We need to leave. Now." But it was too late. As he tried to move toward the door, the room seemed to warp around him. The walls stretched and pulled, closing in on them. It was as if the room was rejecting them, trying to trap them inside. The chest rattled, its carvings shifting and twisting, as if it was alive and trying to break free. The whispers became frantic, almost panicked. The air was thick with a sense of impending doom. The investigators could feel the presence of something powerful, something ancient, waiting to be unleashed. One of the team members, Lisa, screamed as she stumbled backward. Her flashlight flickered, casting erratic shadows across the room. The walls seemed to pulse with a dark energy, and the chest rattled louder. It was clear that whatever was inside the chest wanted to be set free. John grabbed Lisa's arm and pulled her toward the door, but the handle wouldn't turn. It was as though the door had been sealed shut from the other side. They were trapped. In the chaos, the chest suddenly burst open. From within it emerged a dark, swirling mist, an energy so thick and powerful that it seemed to have a life of its own. The investigators could feel it wrapping around them, suffocating them with its oppressive weight. As the mist filled the room, the whispers grew louder, now a chorus of voices crying out in desperation. They begged for release. They begged for freedom. John and his team tried to escape, but it was too late. The darkness had already taken hold of them. When they were found hours later, they were unconscious but alive. But the room had changed. The chest was gone, as if it had never existed. The door was no longer locked, and the whispers had ceased. The investigators left the mansion that day, but they never spoke of what had happened. The secrets of the locked room remained buried, waiting for the next group of curious souls to uncover them. And somewhere, in the shadows of the mansion, the whispers still linger. The janitor had worked in the building for years, but never before had he felt a chill so deep, a silence so unsettling. The old mansion, with its creaking floors and long-forgotten corners, had always been a place of mystery, but nothing compared to the feeling he had now, standing in front of that door, the door that no one had dared to open for decades. His fingers trembled as he gripped the old brass handle, a cold sweat forming on his brow. The room behind that door had always been locked, untouched by time and curiosity. But now, the key was in his hand and the door was waiting. With one last hesitant breath, the janitor turned the key. Hearing the familiar click of the lock, the door creaked open, revealing a room shrouded in darkness. Inside, the air was thick with dust and secrets. The room looked ordinary at first glance, but as his eyes adjusted to the dim light, the janitor saw something he would never forget. In the center of the room, on the floor, was a small chest. It was old, its surface worn with age, and it seemed to pulse with an energy he couldn't explain. But it wasn't the chest that caught his attention. It was what lay next to it. A young girl stood there, her eyes wide with terror, frozen in place. Her mouth opened to scream, but no sound came out. It wasn't until she saw the janitor that she spoke, her voice trembling in fear. "Don't open it," she whispered, her voice barely audible. You don't know what's inside." But it was too late. The janitor, driven by an unknown force, reached out and touched the chest. As his fingers brushed the surface, the room seemed to shift. The air grew heavy and a cold, unnatural silence enveloped him. The girl's face twisted in horror as the chest began to shake. The janitor stumbled back, heart pounding in his chest. It was as if the very walls of the room were closing in on him. He tried to run, but his legs wouldn't move. The chest opened, revealing a dark, swirling mist that began to pour out, filling the room. And then everything went black. If you enjoyed this chilling tale, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Epic Story Moments. Hit that bell icon so you never miss a spine-tingling story like this one. Where are you watching from? We'd love to hear your thoughts and connect with you in the comments below.